As I'm starting this video, I need to preface it with a couple of words. Most notably that I have very little experience with acrylic pigments and enamel washes and effects, like mud and grime. This is something that I am learning and will try to incorporate a lot of these learnings during the process. I will try to replicate the splash effects that you can see in this photo, which has been taken during the Sanremo Rally in 1989, where Lancia debuted the 16-valve Delta with the red livery. On the side of the car you can notice the splash effects, which were made of two layers. One likely acquired during the morning stages but now dry, and the top one with the results of muddy puddles found during this stage when the photo was taken. The first one is light in color, it's dusty and has some very wide and thin splatters all around it. The second one instead is much more contained, much darker and with much thicker splats. All the weathering pigments and effects that I'm using here are from AK and A.Mig. I will leave a breakdown of what I've used below in the description, so feel free to look into that and leave any comments if you need to have more information about anything that is not clear. I am starting my journey into this process with some simple tests. I want to see how acrylic pigments work since I never used them properly nor done any testing with them. I want to see how much their color changes after drying, how well they hold on the surface and what tools work best to create a believable splatter effect like the one I'm trying to replicate. The two pigments I'm using throughout are Dark Earth, which is called AK081, and European Earth, which is called AK042. These seems to match, at least from their powder form, almost precisely the type of mud I'm seeing on the picture. As a way to transport the pigment in an almost controlled way, I have mixed them with a few drops of water. I started by spreading them as is on the test surface, which is something I have created previously, and once dry, I will splatter them a bit. This is to see if this process can create a seamless surface that is believable enough. For the splatter effect, I am using a toothpick and flicking the brush onto it. This is a technique I've seen used in multiple videos online, so it goes without saying that it works for what I need to do. Once it dried, I noticed that there was a difference between the splatter and the underneath spread-on layer. Probably due to the ratio of water to pigment, and this is something I have to keep in mind later and adjust accordingly. As it dried, I noticed that these pigments won't hold on the surface at all, on top of being very thin. What's left on the surface effectively after brushing it away is a very opaque layer on top of the coated and colored area. So now it's time to try out the AK023 Dark Mud. This is an enamel based effect that seems particularly promising. It leaves a nice wet-like effect, exactly what I'm looking for. While it still needs to dry out, I have to admit that I like how it looks. It's as close as it could get to the real thing. The color contrast is fantastic and the thickness is something I couldn't get with the pigment alone. Unfortunately, it looks like it's very oily. And I am no way experienced working with enamels, as the last time I used them was probably 30 years ago. So I think I need to iterate a little bit more over this. I want to see if adding plaster to the acrylic mix will give me more thickness to the base layer, on top of some more durability, hopefully. I am completely winging the proportions as I don't know yet how much the pigment colors and how much the plaster drowns it, so to speak. The base is now dry, and now I can start mixing to create the dark layer. I am still using pigments as I've decided to steer away from the enamel, at least for now. I do need to have a dry, light in color and matte base that I can work with, and if I can pull it off by using the dark earth pigment on top, I've got the right combination. The only thing left is just to figure out how to get the thickness right for the two. As now I am fairly happy with the thickness of the resulting application and the contrast that the two colors have against each other, I am so excited that I decide to rush into applying it to the wheel arches. This is the place where the majority of the mud will usually accumulate. Thankfully, this is also the best place to try it out, so it won't be particularly visible once I will put the tires on. So if everything fails, I can always try to cover it up later on. Without thinking too much, I start applying the same dark pigment to the underbody as well. Unfortunately, as I'm going through this, I also realized that adding the mud on the underbody without any weathering seems like a little bit odd. So I decide to wait for it to dry and, of course, take a thick brush and try to clean it off before moving on. It's not the first time that I'm using the engine grime to do these kind of details on the underbody of cars. And I have to say that it always resulted to be extremely useful in combination with some dark washes. In this case, I'm not going to use dark washes, I'm going to just apply that because I know that everything is going to be covered up by the pigments, so I think it's just a good way to start off. Secondly, I'm also aware that this underbody of this model is not going to be something that is going to be showcased. It's something that I'm going to be doing mostly for myself, as I'm also at the same time trying out techniques that I'm not usually very comfortable with or I haven't even tried before. So overall, I want to see how this combination would work and how much it stands out. There are some major projects in the future that I would like to do that would require this type of details, so I really am curious to see how this turns out. After finishing off the underbody and the wheel arches with both dark and light pigments, and also doing all the splatters needed to give a little bit of, thickness, muddy effect, I have to say that I'm quite satisfied. As it dried, it also kept its structure and thickness. Plus, the color is not that bad, although I still think that the wet part is not there at all. At this point I decide to seal everything with a clear coat. The pigments are not stable once dried, as I noticed in my early experiments. Since in this particular moment I don't have any matte clear coat I can use, I decided to use some highly diluted flat base rough from Mr. Color. I think I used like 1 to 5 or even more, at least. As a A.Mig aficionado, I am still discovering the Mr. Color line and how dilution, application and other things work with it. So I was wrong to think that bases would work the same as normal coats. As the clear coat dried, while giving a very deep matte finish, it also rendered the places where the pigments was very thick quite dull, almost whitening them and removing the majority of the initial mud effect. It effectively goes against what I wanted to achieve, and I think the matte coat is not the right one. Well, I should have realized that earlier, but, well, who am I to say? Here you can see that on a separate template I have replicated the dry splatter effect and coated it with some semi-gloss clear coat. On top of that I have applied the enamel wet mud, and the result seems to be even closer to what I wanted. On the side you can also see the damage done with the matte base rough. I finally get into what I was meant to be doing since the beginning, that is, caking the wheel arches with wet mud. As I just learned, I can apply the enamel effect only after sealing with the clear coat the pigment layer underneath, which would have otherwise left a oily-like stain around it. Before anything else, I want to go through the process I used for weathering the tires, which means a dusty layer and a more contained wet muddy layer in specific areas, as I did before essentially. As a generic advice, I would also recommend you not to use a wet brush to pick up the pigment from the bottle, as I'm doing here, so don't do it, kids. I start by applying the light earth mix on the whole surface of all the tires, in all nooks and crannies, as well inside the tire grooves, for as much as possible at least. Once the layer had dried, I noticed I probably used too much plaster or too little water. So I used a short thick brush to scrape the excessive mix from the tire shoulder and the rim in order to expose a bit of its color. Then comes the time to prepare the mixture for the dark earth and, as usual, plaster, pigment and water. As I said initially, this muddy layer should be more thick and contained. So I use a thinner brush and deposit as much of it on the lower part of the shoulder of the tire. This process is repeated for all the wheels. As I am happy with the results, it's time to hit the spray booth and coat the pigment layer. Unfortunately, as you can see, this process took place at the same time as I was doing the underbody, so what you're seeing here is the same mistake as before. And as before, it's time to apply the dark mud enamel to reinvigorate the dark earth pigment underneath. At the end, I have to say that I'm particularly happy. The dusty layer and the wet mud are noticeably different in both color and thickness, and at scale shows the right amount of detail. So overall, I am 100% satisfied. There's plenty of space of improvement of this process, and it probably needs to be further refined. But as you can see, I'm failing so I can learn, as it's the only way to improve. In my next video, I will share with you the process of weathering the body. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. If you want to see anything different in the future videos or you want to ask me any questions, please leave a comment, I'll be happy to reply. Otherwise, thank you and see you next time.